There is a quiet misunderstanding that surrounds men who do not seek permission from the world, men who move without announcing themselves and decide without asking for consensus. They are often mistaken for being passive, disengaged, or indifferent, when in truth they are operating from a position that is far more uncommon and far more disciplined. The Sigma male exists outside the traditional hierarchy, not because he lacks the ability to lead, dominate, or influence, but because he has no interest in being governed by social leverage, emotional manipulation, or the invisible rules that bind most people into predictable patterns of behavior. For him, autonomy is not a lifestyle preference, it is a psychological necessity, a requirement for inner stability. Most people, whether they are aware of it or not, attempt to control others as a way to feel safe, relevant, or secure. Sometimes this control is subtle, expressed through guilt, expectations, emotional pressure, or unspoken obligations. Other times it is overt, taking the form of authority, threats, dependency, or conditional approval. What distinguishes the Sigma male is not aggression, rebellion, or loud defiance, but a rare quality of non-reactive independence. When attempts are made to control him, the expected emotional responses simply do not appear. There is no argument to latch on to, no visible resistance to push against, and no emotional turbulence to exploit. Instead, something quieter unfolds, something deeply unsettling to those who rely on control as a primary form of connection. The Sigma male does not fight control because fighting still implies engagement, investment, and emotional availability. He simply withdraws his participation with calm precision. Psychologically, this creates disorientation in people who depend on leverage, hierarchy, or emotional hooks because control only functions when there is cooperation. When that cooperation is removed without anger, explanation, or theatrics, the entire structure collapses under its own weight. This dynamic is not about superiority or dominance. It is about self-mastery and emotional sovereignty. The reactions that follow are not theoretical but observable, repeating across workplaces, relationships, friendships, and families with remarkable consistency. When people attempt to control a Sigma male, what they encounter is not resistance, but absence, and that absence forces them to confront the limits of their influence. This is what truly happens quietly and predictably when control meets a man who has already mastered himself. Point 1. Control attempts begin with assumptions, not authority. When people attempt to control a Sigma male, the effort almost always begins with an assumption rather than real authority. And that assumption is that influence operates the same way on everyone. Most people are shaped from early life to respond predictably to social pressure, approval systems, emotional signaling, and unspoken expectations. They learn, often unconsciously, to adjust behavior in exchange for acceptance, safety, status, or validation. The Sigma male diverges precisely at this psychological junction. He does not reject society outright, nor does he posture as a rebel for attention. Instead, he internalizes authority. His decisions are governed by personal principles, long-term reasoning, and internal discipline, rather than collective consensus or emotional negotiation. Because of this, external pressure does not land where it is intended to land. When someone attempts to control him, they typically deploy familiar tools. Guilt framed as responsibility, urgency framed as importance, social narratives framed as morality, fear of exclusion framed as consequence, or reward framed as leverage. The Sigma male registers these attempts without emotional activation. He observes them the way a strategist observes terrain, or the way a scientist observes data. There is no spike of anxiety, no need to defend identity, and no impulse to explain himself. And this absence is critical because control only functions when emotional participation exists. Without emotional buy-in, pressure has nothing to grip. What is often misinterpreted as coldness is actually clarity. What is mistaken for indifference is selective engagement. The Sigma male understands that reacting emotionally would grant the other party influence, so he withholds reaction not as a tactic, but as a default state. This is why attempts to rush him fail. This is why guilt does not anchor. This is why social framing collapses. Silence, in this context, is not submission, it is disengagement. The person attempting control often misreads this silence as compliance or delayed obedience, assuming progress has been made. In reality, the Sigma male has already stepped outside the interaction internally. He continues outwardly polite, neutral, or minimally responsive. But the decision has already been finalized beyond reach. Nothing has shifted. No authority has been granted. This gap between perception and reality is where frustration begins for the would-be controller. The more pressure they apply, the more obvious it becomes that they are negotiating with an absence. The Sigma male is not resisting them. He is simply not available to be moved. Point 2, emotional leverage fails due to internal regulation. As control attempts continue, emotional leverage is often introduced because emotion is the most common shortcut people use when direct authority fails. And this is where many expect visible reactions, such as defensiveness, justification, compliance, or emotional withdrawal. Yet the Sigma male's emotional architecture operates on a fundamentally different axis, one rooted in internal regulation rather than emotional suppression, meaning he fully experiences emotion without allowing it to seize the steering wheel of his behavior. When guilt is applied, he does not instinctively absorb it. He pauses and examines whether the guilt is earned or artificially manufactured. When pressure is applied, he does not rush to relieve discomfort. He calmly assesses whether the pressure reflects objective reality or merely someone else's anxiety seeking an outlet. When expectations are imposed, he does not scramble to meet them for approval. He evaluates whether those expectations align with his values, his trajectory, and his long-term direction. Because every emotional stimulus passes through cognition before becoming action, emotional manipulation fails to produce predictable behavioral change. This does not arise from emotional coldness or detachment from humanity, but from emotional literacy developed through experience, reflection, and self-mastery. The Sigma male understands that emotions are signals carrying data, not commands demanding obedience. He listens to them the way a strategist listens to intelligence reports, carefully, selectively, without surrendering authority. This internal framework makes him extremely difficult to control through emotional tactics because there is no automatic conversion of feeling into compliance. Over time, the individual attempting leverage begins to sense something deeply unsettling. Their emotional signals are not producing the expected outcomes. Guilt does not soften him, pressure does not rush him, and disappointment does not redirect him. The Sigma male does not argue against emotional pressure because argument would indicate investment and a willingness to negotiate his internal order. He does not justify himself because justification would grant the manipulator moral jurisdiction. Instead, he simply refuses to reorganize his behavior around emotional provocation. This quiet non-reaction creates a psychological vacuum where manipulation loses oxygen. As a result, the controlling individual often escalates, intensifying tactics, raising emotional volume, or introducing urgency, unaware that escalation only exposes their dependence on control rather than strength. The Sigma male remains steady, not because he seeks dominance, but because he understands that self-governance is the highest form of power, and emotional sovereignty renders external control obsolete. Point 3, frustration emerges as predictability disappears. Control-oriented behavior relies heavily on predictability, because control itself is a system built on repeated outcomes. Those who seek to dominate others depend on stable cause and effect loops. Pressure produces submission, authority produces obedience, and emotional provocation produces reaction. Over time, they learn which buttons to press and in what sequence. The Sigma male quietly dissolves this entire framework. His responses are calm, measured, delayed, or sometimes entirely absent. He does not mirror emotional intensity, does not escalate tension, and does not rush to explain himself. This absence of immediate feedback creates psychological friction for the controlling individual because uncertainty replaces dominance. The human nervous system is deeply wired to seek predictability. It conserves mental energy and reduces anxiety by allowing the brain to forecast outcomes. When predictability disappears, cognitive strain increases. The controller begins to feel unsettled, restless, and internally pressured because their usual strategies no longer yield results. This discomfort is often misinterpreted as disrespect, defiance, or hidden hostility. In truth, it is neither. It is the Sigma male's refusal to participate in unproductive dynamics. He does not argue because argument still grants engagement. He does not resist loudly because resistance confirms relevance. Instead, he withdraws his emotional availability while maintaining clarity and composure. His autonomy increases quietly. He decides when to speak, how much to reveal, where to invest time, and what deserves attention. This creates a subtle but profound power imbalance. The controller is forced into a reactive position, chasing influence that no longer exists. Each attempt to reassert control only exposes the absence of leverage. The more pressure applied, the clearer it becomes that influence was never real, only assumed. Frustration escalates not because the Sigma male is confrontational, but because he is inaccessible to manipulation. His calm detachment removes the emotional rewards that control-seeking individuals unconsciously crave. Without reactions to manage or emotions to steer, the controller is left alone with their own tension. Over time, this dynamic collapses entirely. The Sigma male continues forward, unaffected, while the controlling individual exhausts themselves, attempting to regain authority over someone who has already stepped outside the system. Point 4. Respect replaces control through psychological realignment. At a certain point, something subtle yet deeply consequential begins to unfold, almost imperceptible at first, like a quiet shift in atmospheric pressure. The individual who once relied on control starts noticing patterns that cannot be ignored. Pressure yields no compliance. Emotional leverage produces no reaction. Authority, when unsupported by substance, dissolves into irrelevance. This accumulation of failed tactics initiates a psychological recalibration. Control, once assumed to be effective, is slowly replaced by a more grounded response. Respect, not admiration, not fear, and certainly not submission, but a sober reassessment of how influence truly functions. The individual realizes, often without verbal acknowledgement, that power cannot be forced where self-possession exists. Influence must be earned through coherence, consistency, and internal alignment. This shift rarely announces itself. It happens quietly, in altered tones of conversation, in softened expectations, and in the absence of previous manipulations. The Sigma male does not negotiate for respect, nor does he resist control aggressively. He simply operates in a way that renders coercion ineffective. He remains calm under pressure, unmoved by emotional bait, and steady in the presence of hollow authority. Over time, others unconsciously begin adjusting their behavior around him. Requests become clearer and more straightforward, stripped of manipulation. Expectations grow more realistic, grounded in mutual recognition rather than dominance. Conversations slow down, becoming more deliberate and sincere. This transformation does not occur because the Sigma male asserted dominance or claimed leadership, but because he consistently demonstrated self-governance. Humans are instinctively attuned to this quality. When someone cannot be coerced yet remains composed, it signals psychological stability, emotional maturity, and an internal authority that does not depend on validation. In environments dominated by superficial hierarchies and performative power, this presence can be quietly transformative. The Sigma male becomes an anchor point, a stabilizing force, not by issuing commands or seeking influence, but through unwavering behavioral consistency. His actions align with his values, his words match his conduct, and his emotional state remains regulated regardless of external pressure. Over time, this consistency rewrites the social dynamic around him. Control loses its function, manipulation loses its leverage, and what remains is a natural respect rooted in recognition rather than fear. Point 5, weak power structures are quietly exposed. When control fails against a Sigma male, what is revealed is not rebellion but exposure. The failure does not come from confrontation or defiance, it comes from absence. The Sigma male does not argue with authority, compete for dominance, or attempt to overthrow structures built on pressure. Instead, he quietly removes himself from illegitimate power dynamics, and in doing so, he reveals their dependency on participation. In workplaces, social hierarchies, and relationships that rely on unspoken coercion rather than mutual respect, control only functions when people emotionally invest in it. The Sigma male does not. He fulfills responsibilities, honors agreements, and operates with competence. But he refuses to play status games, emotional manipulation, or fear-based compliance. This creates a subtle but destabilizing contrast. Others begin to notice that while many are tense, reactive, and dependent on approval, one individual remains calm, effective, and untouched. The question then arises, not verbally but psychologically, why control seems ineffective here? If authority were truly grounded in competence, clarity, and fairness, it would not require constant enforcement. The Sigma male's presence exposes whether power is real or merely performative. This does not create chaos, it creates awareness. Systems built on fragile egos, shifting rules, or emotional leverage become visibly inconsistent when one person is immune to them. Some authorities respond by strengthening themselves, becoming more transparent, more skilled, and more grounded in merit rather than intimidation. Others respond with confusion or quiet collapse, unable to reconcile their self-image with their loss of influence. None of this is intentional on the Sigma male's part. He does not seek to expose, provoke, or reform. His independence simply functions as a mirror. It reflects the health or decay of the structure around him. Because his stability is internal rather than situational, outcomes do not affect him. If the system evolves, he adapts. If it fails, he moves forward without disruption. His strength is not resistance, but self-sufficiency. He demonstrates that true power does not demand submission, and true authority does not fear autonomy. In this way, the Sigma male reshapes environments without touching them, challenges control without opposing it, and remains unaffected because his center of gravity has never existed outside himself. Point 6. The Sigma male becomes increasingly selective and refined. After repeated encounters with control attempts, the Sigma male does not grow cynical or aggressive. He becomes selective. This shift is subtle, almost invisible to the outside world, yet it marks a profound internal recalibration. Rather than reacting emotionally or attempting to overpower others, he begins to observe patterns with clarity. He notices where his energy is respected and where it is extracted. From this awareness, he refines his boundaries quietly and deliberately, not through confrontation, but through choice. Access to his time, attention, and emotional presence is no longer automatic. It's earned through mutual respect and reciprocity. This selectivity is often misunderstood as distance or aloofness, but in truth it's optimization. The Sigma male understands that constant exposure to control-oriented individuals imposes a hidden tax on the mind. Every subtle manipulation, expectation, or power struggle consumes cognitive bandwidth and emotional stability. Over time, these small drains compound, blurring focus and dulling purpose. By choosing his environments carefully, the Sigma male preserves mental clarity and long-term direction. His life becomes simpler, not because he abandons ambition or lowers standards, but because he removes unnecessary friction that slows progress and erodes peace. Complexity gives way to precision. Noise gives way to intention. Relationships become fewer, but they deepen in substance and sincerity. Conversations shift from performance to presence. Interactions become calmer, grounded in mutual understanding rather than unspoken competition. The Sigma male does not isolate himself from the world. He curates his engagement with it, selecting spaces, people, and commitments that align with his values rather than his ego. This curation allows him to move through life with steadiness, unburdened by the need to prove or explain himself. He embodies a form of masculinity that is quiet, stable, and internally governed. When people attempt to control a Sigma male, they eventually encounter a truth they did not anticipate. Control relies on leverage, and leverage only exists where there is dependency. The Sigma male has already withdrawn that dependency by mastering his internal world. He does not dominate others because domination externalizes power and invites resistance. Instead, he dominates his impulses. He governs his reactions, delays gratification, and chooses restraint over reactivity. This self-mastery renders external control ineffective, almost irrelevant. Those who seek to manipulate him often grow frustrated, not because he resists loudly, but because there's nothing to grasp. He does not chase validation, approval, or belonging at the cost of self-respect. And when people try to control a man who has already mastered himself, they learn a quiet, uncomfortable truth. Control only works on those who need approval. Freedom belongs to those who do not.